Parents were constantly working, and they still had like torn clothes and couldn't replace it for months, and it wasn't it wasn't what I would consider to be a reasonable way to live.
We're going to be talking about law today. Law stuff today. How exciting is that? It's
Whoop, whoop.
part of my law class. So we're doing a podcast about law. Specifically, we're going to be looking at aspects of race, rights, criminal law, um, things of that aspect. It's going to be kind of across the board. There's multiple different topics, and we'll kind of hit each one separately, and then we can follow up on the end. But to start, my name's Desiree. I was born in Washington, but I was raised in California. I was raised in the mountains of California, which means that I never grew up in a major city. So I spent most of my time in the mountains as a little mountain child, running around. I am also non Hispanic. I am white. I'm Caucasian. And my history with the law in general has been pretty sparse. Like, growing up in the mountains, it's you have one sheriff. You have more than one sheriff. You have like two or three sheriffs. But like that's all of the sheriffs in your town. Like, it was a very, very small town. So I didn't really experience having to deal with too much like law, the legal system, or the criminal justice system as much. We were a predominantly white town, I would say, but the concept of race was not very big in my town because it just wasn't a thing that came up a lot. We were mixed. We were a mixed town where we had majority of Caucasian and Hispanic where I grew up. So I grew up around a lot of like Hispanic culture, not so much African American culture, but definitely a lot of Hispanic culture because we had ranchers out in the mountains, or what you would call rancheros. So I did grow up with that. So I got to experience that. But ironically, I grew up in Mariposa, which is a mining town next to Yosemite National Park. And my friend always brings up to me that Mariposa had the last remaining KKK group in there. So there's that. But when I was growing up there, that just was not an aspect. Didn't truly experience anything like that. I didn't really grow up with racism. Racism was not a concept that I understood until I moved to Georgia. From Georgia, that's where I really understood the race issues that were going on, and I started to understand the criminal justice issues involving race. That was really kind of where it started for me. Because I left my house when I was 18. So once I left my house at 18, and I grew up pretty well to do in my family. Besides, I had food on the table, but my childhood was not the best, but it wasn't terrible. It just, family dynamic wise, was not the best. So I left my house when I was 18, and then I spent some time in Georgia living by myself. So I got to experience poverty for a bit. Essentially, I had to work all the time to pay my bills, and I barely had enough money for like anything else until I got into the military, where things obviously changed, and then we met each other in California and we hit it off. But we grew up very differently from each other. I'll go ahead and let you introduce yourself.
Well, my name is Xavier. I grew up in the south side of Chicago, specifically a town called Cicero. I am Mexican, Black, and Dominican, some mixture of all three. So I grew up in a single mother household. Uh, I never knew who my dad was, and my uncle was living with us, and both my mom and my uncle were undocumented. So that was something that we had to deal with constantly. We're constantly dealing with the fear of, what if someone finds out that they're undocumented, and then during the early 2000s, that was really big. The threat was constant. But my mom worked 3 jobs. I remember I would get up to get ready for school, and she was already gone. And then I would go to school. I would walk back home from school, and she wasn't there. So I would walk home, and I would get home, and there I would just be all by myself. And that's how I learned how to cook. Like I became very independent. I learned how to cook. I cleaned everything. Like I that's pretty much why I fell in love with the internet, and because that was the place that helped me with my homework. So then my mom would show up somewhere around 7 p.m. And by that time, I already ate dinner. So she would just show up, and she would eat something that I cooked. And then my uncle would also show up around that time. He was a roofer, so he was always working really hard. He worked long hours. Um, and then my mom, some nights she would have to go work as a bartender. So she worked selling insurance in the day, then restaurant in the afternoon, and then she did bartending sometimes. And even with all that stuff, because she was undocumented, she couldn't really she wasn't getting paid a decent wage. So even then, we were just barely struggling to make ends meet. We were never fully homeless, but I remember that being just a constant thing that we needed to worry about. But when it comes to law, I I I've encountered the best and the worst when it comes to law enforcement. I especially with the legal system when it comes to documented people, because uh, there's so many things that it it's kind of like a gray area. But I remember some days when I was going to school, and me and my friends would get stopped, and we would get it's called a Terry stop. So they would stop us and then start telling us, "Oh, we're just searching for weed," and we were kids, so we didn't really like know, hey, like you're not supposed to do that. But you, it was such a routine that we just didn't care. It was just like, all right, like get it over with. Like I'm gonna be late for school. Like just do it. Like do your thing and let me go. And then also there was instances where I met like some really cool police where I'd be running late for school, and they would they would see me, and they're like, shouldn't you be in school? It's like I'm late. And like, all right, do you want a ride? And I'm like, sure. So they would give me a ride to school, drop me off at the front door, and I would, walk in. So I got to experience the racism, and also I guess the humanity of law enforcement. Um, and then when it came to, I remember anytime anytime that we needed to go to court for anything, it was always just I mean, obviously we're the defendants, but we're always like on high alert, because anything that we would say or like hint at my parents or my mom or my uncle being undocumented, it would be basically game over. Like there's fortunately it never happened, but it was something that we were just constantly uh, on the lookout for.
So one thing I want to talk about it and bring up again, because you just mentioned it, was you in the court system. You were having to go to court. How many times was that happening?
Um, I think maybe throughout my childhood, we went to court maybe around 10 times.
What was it for?
Sometimes, so pretty much anytime we got stopped, it was a problem. Like, if we got stopped, while my mom or uncle were driving,
Mm,
we would have to go to court like every single time. So um, I'm not really sure what the law behind that is, but I'm sure it has something to do with the fact that they're undocumented.
hmm.
But it was just every time we had stopped, we always had to go to court.
I see. We're gonna kind of touch on your childhood a little bit more, kind of go back to your childhood. Um, and one thing I want to talk about is kind of the welfare system.
Hmm.
If you had any experience with the welfare system, and the reason I bring this up is because there is a book by Austin Surratt, and I apologize if I butcher any names. And the book is titled "The Law Is All Over," and essentially that book is about welfare recipients, dealing with welfare, dealing with the legal system with that, and how much of a struggle it is for a lot of them because they're trying to navigate the system that they don't understand. A lot of it is a catch 22, and it's not set up in a way to help them get out of welfare. It's a trap essentially where if they make too much money, then they don't get welfare, but they still need welfare. You know, they need money and welfare. There's a section that I want to talk about where Austin is interviewing this gentleman named Spencer, who is in the waiting room. So Spencer is waiting for legal services for public assistance. And in the book, it states exactly, in quotes, the rules Spencer confronts are serious of they says. The rules speak, but what Spencer hears is the embodied voice of law's bureaucratic guardians. For him, as for Kafka's character, the power of legal rules and practices is derived, at least in part, from the incomplete yet authoritative representation of law's categories and abstractions by officials authorized to say what the law is. Essentially, what that statement is saying is that we're all just pawns in the legal system. They make the rules of the game, and we just have to try to figure out what the game is and try to play it as best as we can. And then on top of that, all these wealthy individuals high up on the government food chain is making all of these rules for people like common people like us, you know, who don't make those decisions. We're not very high up, but we are the ones who are affected by these wealthy individuals who have no idea like how it is on our end. So I want to talk about that. If you've ever experienced like being on welfare, so I just want to get your opinions about that.
So as an immigrant, we were not allowed to have welfare. So for immigrants, there's not an option. Like we couldn't use welfare, but there's other little things here and there. Like I would get like because my mom was undocumented and she wasn't getting a certain amount and based off her taxes, so I was able to get free lunches at school, so that was good. And I think that's part of the welfare system, somewhat.
Well, it's funny because like you don't even know, right? Like
Hmm.
these are rules and regulations that you're not even aware of. Like we would not know
Yeah.
as like the common person, which is kind of funny because like that really goes into like what Austin Surratt was saying, where it's a whole legal system that we don't know about. So that was really your experience with like dealing with that and whatnot.
Yeah, I knew a couple of my friends were on welfare, and they weren't living like a great life. Their parents were constantly working, and they still had like torn clothes and couldn't replace it for months, and it wasn't it wasn't what I would consider to be a reasonable way to live.